Grace, over to you.
Good afternoon, everyone. It is with profound honour and immense pleasure that I have the privilege of introducing you to John Cottingham, Professor Emeritus of Philosophy at the University of Reading and Honorary Fellow at St John's College, Oxford University. Mr Cottingham has published over 30 books and 150 articles and was the editor of Ratio, the International Journal for Analytic Philosophy. And he will be discussing both Anselm and Descartes' ontological argument. I encourage you all to engage purposefully and ask questions to develop your understanding. Please join me in welcoming John Cottingham.
Thank you very much for those kind words. It's very nice to be here. So, let me just start by saying a few general things about the role of argument, the role of philosophical argument in religion. How many people do you know who've decided to become believers, or atheists for that matter, just as a result of a philosophical argument, an abstract intellectual argument? In my experience, very few. Being drawn to religion, or perhaps repelled by it, is often a matter of, I think, of one's personal life, of various emotional or spiritual transformations you may or may not have undergone. So, my own view about these arguments, I think they're intellectually fascinating, but I don't myself feel they're decisive in determining whether or not a given person is going to be a religious believer. Now, does that mean I think that being a believer is a purely emotional matter where philosophy is irrelevant? No, I don't think so. It seems to me there is evidence, there are reasons for belief in God, but they're not the kind of reasons, and it's not the kind of evidence that can be scrutinized by a purely detached, rational observer. I mean, if you could prove God's existence with the same rigor as you can prove a geometrical theorem, I don't know if anyone studies geometry here, or the same way you could establish a scientific hypothesis, then presumably there'd be very few atheists or agnostics. So I don't think it's like that. And my own view is that we actually need a new epistemology for religious philosophy. By a new epistemology, I mean a new account of knowledge and evidence conditions. Instead of an epistemology of detachment, which requires us to remain aloof as kind of lordly, detached scrutineers, expecting the evidence to be laid out like a scientific piece of evidence, we may need an epistemology of involvement or engagement. This is one of the things I argue in my latest book called The Humane Perspective, which is published by Oxford University Press this year. Unfortunately, as I was saying to Sam, it's appallingly expensive because OUP have a, I think, exorbitant pricing policy based on the mantra that academic books don't sell except to libraries. But of course the price they put on them means that's a self-fulfilling prophecy. So what is this epistemology of engagement? Well, in the 17th century, Pascal, Blaise Pascal, contemporary of Descartes, or near contemporary, spoke about reasons of the heart. Did he mean by that it's just pure emotion, no reason behind it? No, I think not. I think what he meant was that an emotional change can transform you, can open you to evidence that before might have been unperceived. So I think there is evidence, there are reasons, but they may require a certain emotional transformation before those reasons become transparent. Now, you may say, well, that makes religion sort of too easy. It has a sort of special epistemology of its own. But in fact, I think there are many areas of life where an engaged, committed stance is appropriate. I don't know if anyone's studying English literature, but in the appreciation of a poem, in literary criticism, if you always remain detached and aloof, just sort of scrutinizing the poem as a scientist might, I think you're maybe cutting yourself off from perceiving its qualities. So when approaching a novel or a poem, we may need to be open, porous, as the American philosopher Martha Nussbaum has put it. We may need a certain porousness in order to allow ourselves to be affected by the relevant properties of the poem. Another example is personal relationships. In order to appreciate the properties, the qualities of a person you're trying to engage in a relationship, you have to be, to some extent, open. If you remain always critical, detached, scrutinizing them from an objective perspective, then you may be cutting yourself off from perceiving the qualities that might shine through if you are more receptive. So that's just a sort of brief preamble on what I mean by an epistemology of engagement or of receptivity, rather than one of pure scientific style detachment. Instead, if anything I say is not clear, do indicate, and we can stop and talk about it more. I'll try to allow plenty of time for discussion afterwards. So, how does this affect the ontological argument? Well, it certainly affects Anselm's version. Anselm, as some of you will know, was a Benedictine monk who became Archbishop of Canterbury after the Norman Conquest, way back in the 11th century and early 12th century. And if you read his most famous work, the Proslogion, you'll see that he starts off with a very committed stance. He's very unlike a modern analytic philosopher. In my experience, most of my analytic colleagues are very sort of hard-nosed skeptics. They won't move an inch until you present a rigorous argument. But Anselm, he starts the book already committed. If you look at A on the sheet, he talks about the heart. Speak now my whole heart, say to God, I seek thy face, Lord, will I seek. So he's already quoting one of the Psalms, Psalm 27 or 26 in the Latin Vulgate version. So he's addressing God already before he's starting his proof. So it's very much not a neutral, detached perspective. His approach is one that, in a certain way, is giving ground already in order to allow the truths to become manifest, if they are truths, of course. I mean, one problem with this stance is that we still want to retain some critical perspective. So I'm not arguing we should just give in. Rather like a poem, you need to be porous, you need to be receptive, but you also need to be able to take a step back and start analysing the properties of the poem. So I think the two are compatible. I'm interested to hear what you think about that. So, what is this argument? Well, I've summarised it on B there on the sheet. According to Anselm, he actually quotes one of the Psalms again. The fool hath said in his heart, there is no God. That quotation implies that in saying there is no God, you're already being a sort of fool. I think that's what he means by that. So, why? Because God cannot, according to Anselm, be thought not to exist. Why not? Well, because God is that than which nothing greater can be thought. I've said that's a definition, but actually it's not quite a definition. In fact, Anselm's version of this argument is very different from Descartes. How many people have looked at Descartes' argument? I'm not sure this is right. Well, if you remember that, he's kind of arguing it rather like a geometrical proof. You know, God is the sum of all perfections, so you can't separate existence any more than you can separate certain properties of a triangle from the essence of a triangle. So it's very much based on rigorous definition. But Anselm is not like that. In a certain way, he's saying God is beyond what we can conceive of. People sometimes say, when they're writing this up in exams, Anselm thinks God is the greatest thing you can conceive. But that's not quite right. When you've conceived of the greatest thing you can conceive, you still haven't reached God. It's a sort of receding limit of our understanding. That than which we can't conceive of anything greater. So actually he's not saying that God is comprehensible. And here he follows Augustine, St. Augustine, many centuries earlier. You know, Augustine wrote at the close of the Roman Empire. And Augustine said, I think this is quite a profound truth, if you think you've grasped God, you haven't. What you've got is not God at all, but just an idol of your own creation. God is always beyond the limits of what you can grasp. If you comprehend him, he's not God, says Augustine. This is not Anselm. So Anselm's actually drawing on Augustine here. Si comprehendis non est Deus, he says in Latin, Augustine. Descartes was to kind of pick that up many, many centuries later when he said, this is Descartes in the 17th century, he said, God is like a mountain which you cannot comprehend, comprehendere in Latin, put your arms around, grasp. You can't comprehend it, but you can perhaps reach forward and maybe touch it in your thought. So, now to the actual argument itself, which has caused centuries of debate. And there are still people who think some version of it might be valid. The basic argument is once you've got that notion of God, that than which nothing greater, there are only two possibilities. Either it's real, or it's just in your mind. But, that's the first thought. Second thought, if it's just in your mind, it can't be that than which nothing greater can be thought. Because you can immediately think of something greater, namely a being who's not limited by your own mind. So the very idea of something unsurpassably great, something that exceeds the limits of what we can conceive, implies that such a being must really exist. If it existed merely in the understanding, it wouldn't be God. It's kind of, I always feel it's a sort of frustrating argument because on the face of it, it seems just absurdly presumptuous to just reflect on a concept and say, therefore, God must really exist. But it's quite difficult to refute it. It's quite difficult to devise a counter-argument. One counter-argument is mentioned in C on the sheet there. I thought it'd be useful for you to have some quotations and references. This is Gornillo, another monk who was a contemporary of Anselm's, who said this, I've given you the quote there, could it not with equal justice be said that if I have in my understanding all manner of unreal objects having absolutely no existence in themselves, He gives an example. Consider the myth of the lost island, possessed of all manner of riches and delicacies. If it's more perfect to exist in reality than just in the mind, this fabulous island would have to exist, which is absurd. Therefore, there's something wrong with the argument. This type of objection is known, as you may know, as a reductio ad absurdum in Latin, literally a reduction to absurdity. So the idea is, if that was valid, this would follow, but this is absurd, therefore there must be something wrong. It's a very good technique in philosophy to try and demolish an argument. So that's what I call the overload objection. Why overload? Because it's essentially saying if the argument's valid, you could overload the universe with all sorts of grotesque things, perfect islands and perfect golden mountains, you name it. Well, I think in a way Descartes addresses that kind of objection many centuries later, because he's going to say about Gournillo's perfect island, well, that's just something you thought up. It's not a real entity. It's not a genuine concept, like a triangle is, or a circle. Why is a triangle a genuine concept? Well, because you can prove things about it. You know, in geometry, you can discover new properties about circles and triangles. So there's something authentic about that. Whereas Santa Claus, perfect islands, these are just things you cobble together in your imagination. So I think a defender of Anselm, I don't know how many of you will want to defend Anselm, is going to say, well, that's not really a fair objection. You're just dreaming up a perfect island, and that's very different from that than which nothing greater. Another objection, this is D, is by Thomas Aquinas, probably the greatest theologian, philosopher of all time. And he's the, I don't know if any of you are Catholics, but he's the official philosopher of the Catholic Church, in the sense he's been endorsed by the Church. Though he wrote many centuries ago, in the 13th century. So he's a medieval philosopher, but produced this amazing, enormous compendium of philosophy and theology called the Summa Theologiae. So, yes, as I put there under D, in the late 13th century. And references to Aquinas are all by part and question number, because he divides all his remarks into certain questions. So what he says is very sort of bold, really. Unless it's conceded that something in fact exists, than which nothing greater can be thought, the conclusion doesn't follow. And I think what he's saying there is that once you grant that there is something than which nothing greater can be conceived, then of course the conclusion follows that it exists. But you don't need to grant that in the first place. So he's saying, in effect, it's really just a hypothetical argument. You're saying if there's an X such that it's nothing greater can be conceived than X, then you'd have to agree that it exists. But you don't have to start by saying, yes, there is such an X. I think we might just look at the bottom of the next page, because I think that's really relevant to what Aquinas is saying. This is L, and this is Immanuel Kant, the German philosopher who wrote at the end of the 18th century, so way, way later than Anselm, and even considerably later than Descartes. And he actually, Kant, coined the label ontological argument for this type of reasoning, which, as he said, is purely a priori. people familiar with that phrase, a priori? Just prior to any experience, prior to any reasoning, prior to any observation, just from pure concepts alone. Yeah, so most of the arguments for God are the opposite. They're a posteriori, they start from observations. Most of Aquinas' arguments are like that. They start from, say, order in the world, so there must be a designer, or causation in the world, so there must be a first cause. So they all start from observation. But this one starts from concept, so it's a priori. Anyway, Kant said, this is quoting under L, being is obviously not a real predicate. That is, it's not a concept of something which could be added to the concept of a thing. So, if I say God is omnipotent, God is all-powerful, that's two concepts, God all-powerful. But if I say God is, I haven't added anything yet. So, so when we, according to Kant, when we say there is a God, we attach no new predicate to the concept of God. A predicate is a property or quality or anything you attribute to a subject, right? And I don't know if people find symbols helpful, but modern logic, modern symbolic logic uses this backward E symbol, which is called, can I write, is it okay to write on this?
Is it okay, guys?
Maybe
Yeah.
The
teacher's writing?
Yeah.
No,
There's
it's already
some-
Maybe I
writing.
should write on that.
Looks like there's already writing on it.
It looks like it didn't
There's a
rub off
smiley
though.
face.
Yeah, maybe do this.
Maybe-
this one over here.
This looks like it's designed. So this is the backwards E. And that in modern language just read is there exists an X. Right. So if you want to say God, something is omnipotent, just symbolizing it, say there exists an X such that X is omnipotent. So that's the item you're referring to, and that, I don't know why they write it before the X, because naturally in English you might say X is O, but they just say O applies to X. So there is an X such that X is omnipotent, and X is benevolent, and then you can specify all the other properties of God, all just, all merciful, and so on. But existence, according to this schema, is not one of these properties, omnipotent, benevolent, merciful, and so on. It's not like that. It doesn't tell you about X. Existence just appears in this introductory, what they call a quantifier. It's just introducing, there is an X such that. Rather like il y a in French. Il y a quelque chose qui, well, you haven't said anything yet. You just said, just introducing something. So that's what's meant by saying existence isn't a predicate. It's not a quality or attribute or property of a thing. I don't know what people think about that, but if I say Timbuktu exists, have I told you anything about Timbuktu? It's certainly grammatically, in terms of grammar, Timbuktu is the subject, exist is the predicate. So grammatically, exist can be a predicate. Yeah.
I think it definitely tells us about God if God exists or not. Because that's a pretty significant thing, isn't it? Like, I do think that the existence in real life of something adds something to it than if it was just in my mind. Like, if I imagine a painting versus it being in real life, the fact that I'm saying, oh, the painting that was in my mind, the painting exists now, when it's in reality, it seems like something's added to it.
Yeah.
Do you see what I mean?
Yeah, I think that's a fair point. I mean, after all, we do talk about things, some of which don't exist.
Exactly. We have imagination,
Yeah.
and we know there's a difference between imagination and real life, and that difference is what existence is.
Yes, I mean, there are many things we can discuss. Santa Claus, Father Christmas, unicorns, the characters in Harry Potter. But then, if someone says, well, actually they exist, I've just met some character.
Yeah.
This seems to be new information.
Yeah.
Of course, it doesn't tell us any more about the properties
Sure.
than we already knew.
Yeah.
So if existence is a property, it's a kind of rather weird one, that it doesn't enable you to. So if I say, now I'm now going to talk about the topic for this lecture, and the first thing I'm going to tell you is that it exists. In a way, you're none the wiser what I'm talking about. So there is something strange about this argument. It's treating existence, and actually that applies for those who looked at the Descartes argument. I think even more to Descartes. Let me just briefly mention the Descartes one. It's on E on the sheet, the bottom of the first page. As I've mentioned, it's rather different from Anselm's, because Descartes is not really reaching forward to that than which nothing greater can be conceived. He's really likening God to some definition in geometry. But actually, for those interested in the Descartes stuff, earlier on in the meditations, this argument of Descartes is from the fifth meditation. They were published in Latin in 1641. And earlier on in the meditations, in the third meditation, he has a way of approaching God which is a bit more like Anselm, because he says he considers himself as a finite, limited thinker. As you know, he starts from I think, therefore I am, and then as soon as you know you exist, which is the first point of certainty, you know at once that you're imperfect, and many things you don't know and can't do. So I know I'm imperfect, you know you're imperfect. But we also have the concept of perfection, which we know is different from us. And that sense of the otherness of infinite perfection, Descartes reasons, I can't have thought up myself. It must have been put in me by a being who is itself infinite. Anyway, I won't go into that this afternoon, but it shows that he's, as it were, receptive to that line of argument, the finite mind encountering something infinitely greater than itself. But in this fifth meditation argument, it's much simpler. It's just, as I've put it in 3 steps there, God is the sum of all perfections, existence is a perfection, therefore God exists. And he explicitly compares a triangle. Does anyone do maths? Yeah, okay. Well, I don't know if that you include geometry, including in geometry, but there are certain properties that can be proved of a triangle, e.g. its angles equal 180. So once you define the triangle, you can rigorously prove its angles must equal 180. Notice that's true whether or not there are any triangles. Maybe there's no triangle exists on Earth. But whether or not it exists, its angles must equal 180. So Descartes' argument really is, by parity of reasoning, whether or not God exists, he must exist. Therefore he exists. So as he puts it, once you know the essence of God, namely sum of all perfections, and you realize that existence is one of those perfections, then you can't take existence away. It's, as it were, built in to the very concept of this totally perfect being, right? Just as angles equal 180 is built in to the concept of a triangle. So you cannot separate existence from the concept of God any more than you can separate the properties of a triangle or circle from that concept. There are lots of other objections there which I've written on the sheet, which you might be interested in looking at later on. But let's just pause there. And has anyone got any questions or thoughts about what I've said so far, either about Anselm or about Descartes, or indeed about this idea about an epistemology of involvement? Yeah.
So, in response to Descartes' geometric-like argument, so I would say that you can prove 1 or 2 plus 2 equals 4 mathematically, but that doesn't necessarily mean it exists physically or even metaphysically.
Yes. Certainly not in the real world. I mean, I suppose it's quite hard to give an account of where these mathematical entities exist. Perhaps where is the wrong word. Certainly when mathematicians prove theorems about numbers and prime numbers, they're talking about something, but they're not talking about something physical. So mathematics is not physical science. Nonetheless, it does seem that they can produce valid demonstrations. So it's a good question you've raised there. I think Descartes would say all you need to concede is that their valid properties can be demonstrated of triangles, whether or not they exist. And similarly, this property of God can be demonstrated in him, whether or not he exists, if you like, inverted commas. Therefore, he must exist. Because if something exists, whether or not it exists, then it exists. Again, it's a slightly irritating trick in the argument, rather like Anselm. Yeah.
It's kind of on from that. It seems that the God that both Anselm and Descartes are describing is so far from what we know to be a Christian God, who interacts with the world, who loves people, who kind of all of these things. Supposedly the Christian God is this God, but it seems like this really tells us nothing about the Christian God. So why do we decide that we can draw lines between the two, when this greatest possible and greater than we can possibly conceive, we class that as God? Why do we think that we can then say, oh yeah, it's the Christian God from the Bible?
Right. There's a fascinating issue you've raised there. And I think, in fact, there are two notions of God going in theology, really. One is this, what you referred to as a personal God who interacts in the world. But actually the more traditional conception is what we find in Aquinas and other medieval theologians, that God is actually the mysterious source of existence. He's pure. Aquinas describes God as pure being. So, and some modern theologians talk about the ground of being. So, according to that conception, the thought of a God as a sort of Superman who intervenes, rewards his followers and zaps his enemies, is actually idolatrous, superstitious and idolatrous. The true God would be the mysterious source of everything that is.
Does that undermine the Bible?
Well, there's nowhere in the Bible which says that God is a person.
Sure.
God is described on analogy with a person, but not literally, of course. I mean, for example, in the Lord's Prayer, God is referred to as a father. That's not to be taken literally. It's only a kind of analogy which enables us to reach towards the idea of God, but is not to be taken as a statement about God. So I think I think the answer to your question is really quite tricky and complex, because people have different concepts of God. Some clearly do think of God as a sort of personal friend, an item in the universe. The God hypothesis, as Richard, I don't know if anyone reads Richard Dawkins, the famous critic of religion. He talks about, rather scathingly, a God hypothesis, in order to say, well, you know, here's science, good hypotheses which can be tested, and here's the God hypothesis, some item in the universe which we can't test with. But I think, according to going back to this question, the God of mainstream theology is not an item in the universe. Rather, it's the source of everything that is. So it's not a sort of force alongside doctors or viruses or whatever, which is why, in my opinion anyway, that these experiments to see if people get better when they're prayed over are actually idolatrous and blasphemous, because God is not a separate causal item alongside these other ones. These are quite deep questions actually, because they relate to a concept which isn't fully definable in the way in which, say, triangles are. Yeah.
So these arguments, they're basically discussing the existence of God, but what is existence? How is that kind of like categorized? What makes something exist? What's the difference between something that exists and something that doesn't exist?
Yes, that's a great question. I've actually, it's kind of apt because I've just published a paper called What is Existence? And one of the answers I give there is that the standard attempts to explain it are pretty useless. Bishop Berkeley, George Berkeley in the 18th century said to exist is to be perceived. But that doesn't seem right, because if all of us, in fact if every sentient being on the planet was eliminated, I think intuitively you want to say the tables and chairs and trees and so on would still exist. So existing isn't just being perceived. Later, John Stuart Mill said exist is to be capable of being perceived. But that doesn't really, I think, get us very far either, because what he's saying is to say this table exists means that it could, if there were an observer, they could perceive it. But actually all that means is if there were an observer, they would have some actual existing sensations. So it's a sort of circular definition. Science, I think, can't explain existence. I mean, I don't know if anyone's doing physics or cosmology, but sometimes people say, you hear scientists saying, things pop into existence out of a quantum vacuum. But a quantum vacuum is not nothing. So that science doesn't really explain how from nothing you get existence. And theology, I don't really think explains it either. You can say, well, there's God, but God is this mysterious, ungraspable source of existence. So it's not really an explanation. My own view is that this actuality, what it is actually to be here, to exist, is a philosophical mystery. It seems odd to say that, because we all intuitively think we know what existence means. But maybe we don't. And maybe that sense of mystery is at the root of the religious impulse. We sort of reach forward for some ground of this mysterious being here that we all experience, that we can't fully explain. Anyway, yeah.
Would it be a jump in logic from Anselm's argument to assume that if there was a being that which nothing great could be conceived, that it wouldn't need the ontological argument to prove its existence?
Well, yes, I think there's all these arguments presuppose there's a kind of dependency relation. We, the philosophers, the theologians, need to try and establish if there is any ultimate perfect being, supremely unseen. But the being doesn't need us. So if there is such a reality, it would be prior to human understanding. And that's actually relevant to Descartes. I don't know if you looked at him, but you know Descartes starts with I am thinking, which he thinks is the first truth. And some people, I think wrongly, say that Descartes is just trying to construct everything from himself. But actually he's not, because as soon as that meditator is aware of his existence, he's already aware that there must be something greater than himself. So there's although in the order of discovery, for Descartes, I come first, and then God, and then science. In the order of reality, it's God for Descartes. It's God first, and then minds, and then bodies, and so on. So the priority is with God, not with the human inquirer. Yeah.
My point's similar to Grace's first point, but hypothetically, like if a maniac was get cancered, and then I describe him to like black hair, dark skin, or brown eyes, and then I told you that he existed. Would that invoke fear within you? And if so, would that mean that Anselm's argument may not be the proof for the existence of God, but rather the comfort of existence for the believer?
Well, this imaginary being, are you suggesting you could prove this sinister figure actually exists?
Well, if I told you that he existed and he was just around the corner, would that scare you? And would that make you feel something? And if it did, would that make this argument feel something for the believer? Not necessarily the infinite.
Yeah, I think there's something in that thought. I mean, if we imagine, well, let's say the maximally scary being, if such a being was just your invention, it wouldn't scare me. But if he was really outside the door, then that would be more powerful, more impressive, more scary. So once you say that that really existing makes something more powerful, you seem to be able, I mean, it's rather like the overload objection then, I think. It seems that you could sort of wish into existence all sorts of things and then say, well, because they're greater if they really exist, therefore they must exist. But there does seem to be something wrong with that. I think, as I said at the beginning, I doubt if anyone's going to sort of be converted either for or against religion by these logical arguments alone. So that there is a sort of puzzling quality to the ontological argument, which I think is, for those who already believe, it might seem to reinforce that sense of this greatest conceivable being. But for those who don't, it's just going to seem like a trick, a logical trick. Yeah.
I'm so sorry.
One behind you first.
Okay,
yeah.
go.
About your epistemology of involvement and kind of what you just said about for the believer. I understand that in some of your work you critique secular moral philosophy's kind of inability to actually get to the deeper meaning of something. And like you were saying, how analytic philosophy kind of gets not involved in actually what it's talking about, and it's just looking at whether or not something is true from an objective standpoint. Do you think the ontological argument actually has any relevance or religious significance for a believer, like completely not focusing on atheists to try to convert anybody? Do you think it actually has any religious significance for a believer?
I think it does. I think that's an interesting question. I think the Anselmian idea of the unsurpassably great being is relevant to the conception we form of God, and therefore it's relevant to the believer. because it rules out various kinds of idolatrous or superstitious conceptions. I think anyone who's signed up to a religious sect or denomination in order that they thought they'd found a way of doing better in their exams or getting a better job because they could pray to God and he would do the trick if they did certain things. That would essentially be an idolatrous conception, superstitious conception. Immanuel Kant, who I referred to earlier, makes this point in his book Religion Within the Limits of Reason. So I think the Anselmian view does alert us to a conception of God which is more religiously authentic than these simplistic ideas of God as a sort of shortcut to worldly success.
Do you think the Cartesian idea doesn't, just because it's kind of removed from this idea of God as a greatest evil being, it's just kind of similar to the triangles in mathematical essence?
I think the fifth meditation one, right, but I think earlier in the meditations, in the third, you do get this idea of the encounter of the finite mind with the infinite, which is something which isn't fully encompassed. And indeed, in that simile I quoted from the mountain, that's actually in a letter Descartes wrote to his editor, Anselm. It's not in the meditation. But if God is like that mountain that you can't put your arms around, that's a kind of Anselmian flavour to that. It's greater than you could ever comprehend. So I think there's something authentically religious in Descartes. Why, having made that step in the third meditation, he went on to produce the ontological argument, or a version of it, I don't know. I don't think any commentator has really explained why we get two proofs. But maybe he wanted an a priori proof, because the one in the earlier one is kind of depends on experiences, my experience as a finite being, and what thoughts come into my mind. So maybe he thought it'd be nice to produce an a priori one. But it's a good question. Yeah.
Do you think that any of the objections to Anselm's ontological argument sort of pose a threat to its status as a proof of God? Or do you think that Anselm's argument still manages to show that God does exist and he is a being in which nothing greater can be conceived?
Well, my own view is that I think Aquinas was right to reject the argument in sort of technical terms, because either reality is such that there is a being than which nothing greater can be conceived, or reality is not like that. And it seems to me atheism is a coherent possibility. You could say, well, the universe is just a series of events that comes into being and passes away, and there is no greater beyond it. There is no ultimate ground or ontological root to it. It just is there. There was a famous debate between a Jesuit philosopher, Frederick Copleston, and the arch-atheist Bertrand Russell. You may have seen this. It's reproduced in Russell's book, Why I Am Not a Christian. And I think Copleston says something like, are you just saying that the cosmos is utterly contingent and gratuitous, without any basis or ground? And Russell replies, I should prefer to say it is just there. And I think that is a possibility. We have to say that's a coherent possibility. It could be just there. But having said that, I've come to think there is something in the human spirit which is never content with just there. Even if you could give a complete map of the cosmos the grand theory of everything that Stephen Hawking used to talk about. Even if you could map it all out, I think the human spirit is such that we could always raise further questions. So there's that restlessness in the human mind, which I think could never be content with saying it's just that. That doesn't prove, I don't think that proves that there is some further unsurpassably great source, but it kind of gestures in that direction. I think it's rather like reaching towards the mountain, and maybe even thinking we touch it, but it's pretty tentative. Yeah.
With the ontological argument, as you showed on your sheet, and as Myra said, there's so many criticisms. Why do you think the ontological argument has persisted through so much time and so many criticisms?
Yeah, well, it's a good question. Certainly, the fact that Aquinas didn't accept it, there's the great Catholic philosopher, Thomas Aquinas. He has five, as you know, five arguments for God's existence, but then he goes on to reject the ontological argument. So you might have thought, well, that would put the boot in, but it's kind of, then Descartes revives it, and then in our own time, there's an American philosopher, Alvin Plantinga, who's devised a very intricate version of it. There's something about it that won't quite lie down and die, even despite the Kantian thing which I put at the bottom about existence not being a predicate. In a way, that should have finished it. But then Plantinga thought he had an answer to that. Actually, in a way, I think this is true, I don't know what you think about this, of most philosophical problems. That a true philosophical problem is one that keeps recurring, because it somehow captures that restlessness of the human spirit that can't finally be settled. So, for example, are we truly free, or are we just biologically or genetically determined? That's a question which was debated way before Christ, and is still being debated by philosophers. So you could think that philosophical questions these have this power to disquiet us, to disturb our peace even when we think we've settled it. And I think the ontological argument is rather like that. Some of the reasons which come up this afternoon. So before you go. Anyone who hasn't had a go yet,
Yeah.
let it come in. Okay, go ahead.
I'm most interested by the concept of the greatest conceivable being, because who are we as humans to say that the greatest conceivable being involves the being who can love and or is omnipotent or omniscient, because knowledge is what we know it to be when it could be so kind of far beyond what we know. Why do we think as humans that we can define the certain characteristics that the greatest conceivable being would have, when greatness is only as far as we know as humans?
Yeah. Well, if the greatest conceivable being was not all-powerful, then there would be something it couldn't do. So that would already show it wasn't the greatest.
Yeah.
So I think you can prove omnipotence. You can perhaps prove omniscience if there were things he didn't know, or it didn't know, it wouldn't be the greatest. You can prove uniqueness, because if there were two such beings, both of whom were all powerful, there would be something each of them couldn't do, then zap the other one. So I think you can get quite a long way.
I think it's love the one.
Whether you get the moral properties, yes, that is seem a different sort. Descartes was asked about this. I can't recall the exact context, but I think the basic line is, some of this comes in the Meditations, that say evil, desire to deceive people or to hurt them, is a sign of some weakness, some defect. So a supremely perfect being wouldn't need to do that. So that gets you a sort of door open to the moral properties. But in calling God loving, as one of the questions earlier, it's a kind of analogy to human love. Human love, when you love someone, you respond to their qualities. So the love is called forth by the person or the object. But divine love, this is Thomas Aquinas, is not like that. Divine love infuses and creates goodness in the world. So it's quite unlike human love. It's kind of creative love. And we can't quite grasp what that would be, actually. Because normally we are drawn to objects because they are good or beautiful or whatever. But God conceived as the supremely perfect being would not be drawn in that way. It would just be a single creative act. So again, we do get beyond the bounds of understanding. I think there's at least a pointer towards the moral properties there. So it's a good question. Yeah.
Could the greatest conceivable being be omni-malevolent?
Yeah, yes, you're thinking of Stephen Law and the omni-bad God, yeah. Well, to try and refute that, I think you'd have to argue that malice is a sign of imperfection. After all, why would you lie to someone? What? Because you're frightened of them, or because why would you hurt them? Because they threaten you or so. And so as soon as you start thinking of the reasons for malevolence, they all seem to hinge on imperfection. So you could use the Anselmian sort of line to say that this unsurpassingly perfect being just wouldn't have any need for such malice or...
Does that then beg the question, who defines perfection?
Right. Well, I think the thought would be, yeah, the thought about the malicious person would be that it's some defect in them which must lead to this malicious act. If they were supremely content, self-sufficient, then there wouldn't be any need for such acts. Do you find that seems to me quite...
No, I agree that it is a defect, but I think society would agree.
Right. Yeah, you'd have to argue that evil arises from a negation or defect, which is, there's an argument to that effect in St. Augustine. Yeah.
Surely if the telos or goal of something is to be evil and omni-malevolent, then its definition of perfection would be to be as evil as possible. And according to Anselm, to do the same thing, it would be more evil for it to actually exist than for it to not exist at all. So therefore, the most evil being does exist, because it would be less evil for it not to exist than it would be for it to exist.
It's a good point. But you'd have to show that it's coherent for a telos, that's to say a goal, to be evil. I mean, what would you be actually aiming at if you were aiming at evil?
Or whatever the most evil thing possibly could be.
Everything is desired under the appearance of the good, though, isn't it? So Lucifer, the devil, thought it would be good to rebel against God. So even that evil act was desired by Lucifer under the appearance of something good.
Or if you thought that you only wanted to be bad, and that was the worst act, the most bad act.
Well, but what would wanting to be bad be? You could want to be rebellious.
The opposite of being good.
It seems that there's that's an interesting point. It seems there's a logical connection between being an object of desire and that thing being good, at least for you, or at least according to your perception. So in Milton, does anyone know Paradise Lost? Satan says, "Evil be thou my good. So it's possible to think of such a being, but that would be a being who pursues what they take to be good, perhaps mistakenly, perhaps out of pride or envy or something like that. But then we're back with malice being a sign of weakness or deficiency.
Katie, you okay to do the close?
Yes. Thank you, John Cottingham, for your time today. It's greatly appreciated, and it's been very helpful hearing your insightful presentation on the ontological argument. I thought you answered all our questions very well and very thoroughly, as it's quite a complicated argument. And yeah, can everyone join me in saying thank you today for your time?
Thanks very much, and thanks for coming. And if you spot anything on the handout which is not clear, do email me or through Sam or whatever, and I'll endeavour to improve the next edition of this handout.
Great. Thank you very much.